I'm looking at a room full of familiar, friendly faces today, so it's not really a problem for me to stand up here and talk to you about God or Jesus or salvation. And I would guess that it's probably going to be like, it would be the same way for any of you amongst this group, right? We don't have any problem talking to each other. But let's think outside the box today a little bit. Let's think outside the box of these four walls, because there's a lot of people who aren't in here. Those people who are outside these walls that either don't know much or care much about what we're doing here and what we're talking about and singing about. And then there are those who would have utter disdain for what we think and believe. A lot of people are hostile towards things that we believe. Some people think that what we're doing is wasting our time, and this is things that gullible or self-righteous or intellectually challenged, boring people do. Now, I know those people are out there, and I know they exist because I used to be one of them. You know, you've heard my story. However, there's a lot of people outside these walls also who, at this very moment, are worshiping and praising God and Jesus Christ. You know, there's a lot of churches in this area. And we don't know many of those people simply because we don't go to the same church. But we don't have any problem associating with them, you know, when we attend combined services with them. And certainly anybody from those churches is welcome to come to us and be part of our fellowship as well. So we're not awkward with those people. We welcome all who wish to be a part of the effort to participate with Jesus as he grows his kingdom. But who are we trying to reach? I mean, are we trying to proselytize, get other people from other congregations to come join us? I mean, is that the purpose of the church? And it really isn't. I know the story about when Rick Warren was building his first church. His whole purpose was to reach people who weren't going to church, not get members from other churches. So, who did Jesus come to save? Let's read a story. It's a very familiar story. And if you want to read along, it actually is in Luke. Chapter 19 starts in the first verse. And it says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zaccheus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he couldn't because of the crowd. You know how normally, you know, with parades, if you've ever watched a parade with small children, you know, they can't see because all the grown-ups and stuff standing in front of them are too big. But, you know, their parents will pick them up, put them on their shoulders so they can see. Well, nobody was going to do that for Zaccheus, and you'll know why. But he couldn't see because of the crowd, so he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zaccheus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. And Zaccheus came down. He came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Now all the people saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zaccheus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come into this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save what was lost. You know, Tony's, what he was speaking about today was actually a kind of a good introduction to what I'm speaking about today. Because, you know, who are we trying to reach? You guys remember, I don't know how many people went to Sunday school and learned that little song about Zaccheus was a wee little man, and a wee little man he was. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And as the master passed that way, he looked up in the tree and he said, Zaccheus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. Remember that song? I don't remember the tune. And believe me, Sunday school when I was a kid has been a very long time ago, okay? How many of you have sung that song? Anyway, you get the impression that Zaccheus was a sweet little man with one basic problem. He was short. Too short to see Jesus. Now, if that's your impression of Zaccheus, that's not even close to the truth. Well, let's look at the setting of the story. The account of Zaccheus begins with Jesus coming to Jericho. Now, you may remember Jericho also from ancient history as a city that Joshua and the Israelites marched around it 7 times, and then the walls came tumbling down. The walls came tumbling down. Remember that tune. But now, just south of that Old Testament city was where they built the new Jericho, and it was very prosperous city. It was a trade center, and very prosperous, doing very well from an economic standpoint. Now, apparently, I don't know what other reason Jesus had for coming to Jericho, except he was actually looking for Zaccheus. He knew he was going to see him there. Kind of shows that Jesus will go to pretty good lengths to get you if he wants you, you know, so. In Bible times, you realize that people either were named, either according to their character, the circumstances of their birth, or a physical characteristic, or what a person did for a living. Esau, for instance, you know, red because he was hairy and the color of his hair was red. And then there was Nabal, Abigail's husband. Now, his name meant fool. And he actually lived up to that name when he almost got his whole family killed when he refused to feed David and his men. But how would you like that name? You know, say, hey, fool! Of course, I heard about a family in Wyoming whose last name was Outhouse, and maybe back in someday the fellow built these little buildings with the crescent moon and stuff, but you know, I think I'd probably rather be called fool. Anyway, there was a meaning behind Zacchaeus' name as well. It meant pure or righteous. He wasn't. Zacchaeus was probably one of the most hated men in all the region of Jericho. And why? Was it because he was a short guy? Well, no, although I don't suppose that was an asset, but shortness made it easier to others to make fun of him and push him aside and ignore him, if you'll pardon the pun. As far as some people are concerned, Zacchaeus just didn't measure up. But the shortness would have been a disadvantage, but that wasn't why he was disliked. This man was a tax collector. And you know what public sentiment is towards tax collectors, even now, the IRS, but public sentiment towards tax collectors in Jesus' day was that they were scum of the earth. In the Gospels, we're told no less than 8 times that people complained about Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners. It's kind of like if there was 2 classes there. There was sinners, and then there was a special class of sinners called tax collectors. But Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. He was a big kahuna. He was in class all by himself. So, you know, those people were they were considered to be traitors to the nation of Israel because they didn't work for the nation of Israel, they worked for the Romans. And Romans, they didn't like. They hated the Romans. So, and not only were the tax collectors considered traitors, but they're also seen as thieves. You see, the Romans did demand a tax from the people, but they didn't pay the tax collectors. The tax collectors were in their own little business. They collected the Romans' tax, but then they got to add a percentage for themselves. And so they could, a savvy tax collector could get pretty rich, earn a lot of money without really having to earn a lot of money. You know what I mean? He didn't have to be fair because he had the Romans backing him up, so he could do any darn thing he wanted to, and most of the time they did. And why would Zaccheus take a job like that? Well, nobody liked him anyway, right? So, little short guy and all that. Now, some of this is going to be a little speculation because we're not told a whole bunch of these things, but I'm kind of leading into a comparison with some of the people that we might not want to associate with. But, let's just say that, he obviously really didn't care about people because they didn't like him because he was short, and they made fun of him and pushed him around some when he was younger, so he grew up to be a tax collector. And now people feared him because he had power and he had influence, and he was a rich man. So those people who had mistreated him in the past, he could get revenge. Zaccheus had everything a man could possibly want: power, riches, control of his life, and control of others. And these things, power, riches, and control, had blinded his spiritual eyes. We're speculating now. We're kind of playing out and building a story on top of a story. And so let's just say that he had built walls around himself designed to insulate himself from insults and indignities of the past. Maybe he had spiked hair and offensive tattoos. Ooh, people like that? See, and do you want to approach those people? We don't, do we? On top of this, his profession required him to have continual contact with Romans, those hated Gentiles, and that made him ceremonially unclean, which means he couldn't even go to the temple and offer sacrifices. So he was stripped of the privilege to worship God. Thus, he was effectively separated from God. So, like I say, that's kind of how I picture Zaccheus, a rich, lonely, isolated guy who had everything except what he really wanted. You remember the movie, which I've never watched the entire movie at one spot, but It's a Wonderful Life, right around Christmas time. And there's a character in it, Old Man Potter. And Old Man Potter is a penny-pinching, self-centered, bitter old man. And the perfect example of that old adage, money doesn't buy happiness. Well, maybe you have a flavor of the kind of person Zaccheus was. And then Jesus comes to town. And Jesus had been preaching and teaching throughout Galilee, Samaria, and Judea for the better part of 3 years. Now, this was his first visit to Jericho. And Jesus was a famous person. Everybody wanted to see him. Rumors are floated around town that this man does miracles. He raises the dead, feeds thousands, heals the lame, the deaf, and the demon-possessed. And not only that, when this man speaks, it's like the voice of God himself. Word has reached Zaccheus about Jesus. And there's something about Jesus that strikes a hidden chord. It's been rumored that Jesus doesn't care who you are or what you look like or what you've done. Word has it that this Jesus is eaten with tax collectors. Matter of fact, they said one of his disciples had been one. His name was Matthew. They even said, this is a good one, that Jesus had told the chief priests and tax collectors would make heaven before they did. Ooh. Maybe, just maybe, this Jesus could give him acceptance. You know, acceptance that he's been craving. And this might be his one and only chance to find out, because Jesus might not come around again for a long time, so Zaccheus rushed to the street. He made a beeline to the road in which Jesus was traveling through, but he can't get through because nobody likes him, nobody wants him there. You can see this little short man jumping up and down trying to see over the crowd, and then he sees this sycamore tree. Now, sycamore trees of that region were actually fig trees, and they have low-growing branches that they're easy to climb. Even children can climb them. Matter of fact, grown-ups probably never climb trees, but in this case he did, because even though it was a rather undignified thing to do, he wanted to get up there. So finally along comes Jesus, and the people are crowding around, trying to get his attention, touching his clothes, calling his name, and gentle and kindly man that he is, Jesus slowly makes his way through the crowd, speaking to people as he passes. And then he comes and stops at the base of the tree. Looks up right at Zaccheus. And then he says, Zaccheus, come down from that tree. I want to go home, go and eat at your home. Jesus spoke to him. Jesus wanted to go to his house. Jesus had accepted him. Jesus said, I must stay at your house today, not just to visit, but to stay and live with you, to abide in you, is what he was saying. Now, for Zaccheus, this is probably the first time in a long time that anyone has wanted to eat at his house. But notice verse 7, the reaction of the people on that road. All the people saw this and they started to mutter. He's gone to be the guest of a sinner. Now, in the original language, that means complained or grumbled, and the only other time in the New Testament that same word is used is exactly the same meaning. Only that time he's talking about the priests, but this time it was the people, so it was the priest and the people all had that same attitude. So, you know, the priest said, oh, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Ugh. You know. Well, you know what that tells us is you don't need to be a Pharisee to act like one. You know, Jesus opposed the Pharisees because they were convinced of their own righteousness and were sure they were the privileged ones who had a special spiritual insight and they could perceive pure religion, and others were blind. That was their attitude. But are we like the Pharisees and all those people along that road who complained about Zaccheus and Jesus talking to him because Jesus loves the sinner? You know, he loves the people that we love to hate. There are certain people, maybe certain groups of people we really don't care for, and maybe we don't hate them exactly, but they're nothing like us, and because of that, we don't feel comfortable in their presence. And it doesn't just stop there. It can be, for some of us, there are people within our own families or extended families that we have trouble with either loving or forgiving. Maybe it's somebody who always shows up at family gatherings, and that's one of those people you just don't want to be around them that much, but they always show up, you know, so, grr. Or maybe there's something that somebody did at some point that you just have a lot of trouble trying to forgive and forget. Like I heard this story about an 80-year-old woman arrested in Cincinnati for shoplifting. And so when she went before the judge, he asked her, "What did you steal?" And she said, "I took a can of peaches." The judge then asked her, well, why she had stolen a can of peaches. And she just said, "Well, I was hungry." Well, she had kind of a pretty nonchalant attitude about the whole thing. And the judge says, "Well, you know, with that attitude and stuff, he has to sentence her to something, you know, sometime." Trying to figure out what to do. So he came up with a bright idea and said, "Well, okay, ma'am, how many peaches were in that can?" And she said, "6. He says, "6? Okay. Then I'm going to sentence you to 6 days in jail." And so just before he goes to bang the gavel and finalize it, all of a sudden the husband raised his hand, "Judge, can I say something?" And the judge said, "Sure, what is it?" He says, "She also stole a can of peas." Might be a little forgiveness problem there. So let's look back at Zaccheus in the tree as Jesus saw him and consider this. You know, what about that so-and-so that rubs you the wrong way? Or the group of people that leaves you cold? How about those who wronged you and whom you find difficult any kind of forgiveness or forgetfulness? You might find it impossible in a way without God's help, because we don't develop Jesus' attitude on our own. That's not human, you know. And Jesus was fully human, but he's also fully God. So we need that help. If you look around, you're going to find the strangest and most unlikely people up in that proverbial tree. And, you know, we've got to learn to look at them the way Jesus does. Will we be able to accept them? Can we seek to build bridges? Are we willing to be Jesus to them? We may be the only ambassador of Christ that they will ever see. May God, in his great grace, through Jesus Christ, grant us the ability to see them the way he does. Because we don't have the ability within ourselves. Amen?